Hey everyone. Apologize for the delay in getting this next lecture posted. Uh, I'm traveling home and then getting things settled here just took me a little bit longer than I thought. Um, I've decided to kind of rotate a couple things on the syllabus. So instead of going into the data part now, I I'm going to talk about criteria and alternatives. This way, we kind of finish up the general sort of policy analysis process, and then we'll do the sort of measuring stuff lecture as well as a specific lecture on measuring social welfare, since that's a very important concept and part of what it is that we're trying to do here. Um, so I think this makes a little bit more sense to do it, and I'll update the syllabus and stuff to make sure that everyone's clear on what's going on. Um, but that's where we're at. You do have a problem set due um, early next week, and that will be posted today. um, it's pretty quick. It's just a sort of intro problem set on these last few lectures, and get you an idea as to how these things generally will look as we go throughout the semester. So hope everyone's doing well. And let's talk about criteria. Okay. Before we get into the specific criteria that we generally use when analyzing policy, um, it's important to go back to this whole concept of intentionalism, of being intentional about what it is that we're doing. Um, and all this really means is that we have a goal, and that goal needs to be fairly clear. Okay, so there are these three general characteristics that you need to have in terms of your goal. The first one being clarity, that it is very obvious what it is that you're trying to do. That if you're writing it down or you're talking about it, that you're using the language that is easily understood. The second one is the goal has to be realistic. Okay, it has to be something that we can actually achieve. And so, that's why we talk about the goal isn't to eliminate poverty. It isn't to, um, eliminate government, like fraud and waste, because unfortunately, those things are going to be existent. We can minimize them, right? We can set a goal to reduce them. We could even set a goal to reduce them by a certain percentage, although then you kind of get in a little bit of trouble. But so we just want to make sure that what we're doing is achievable. Um, and then the last one is we have to be able to measure progress towards reaching that goal. We have to lay out in advance the metrics that we're going to use to gauge progress. Okay. And that progress is going to occur over a period of time, and we need to be able to collect the data and say we're sort of moving towards. Um, so if you think about all the COVID regulations, you think about all the reopening and why now several states are having to kind of go back. In North Carolina, we're kind of putting a pause and then adding this new mask requirement. But from the beginning, sort of the epidemiological experts and other sort of experts set very specific goals that they thought ought to be achieved before reopening began, especially in any kind of serious or broad fashion. And if you look at it, it did meet these sort of three characteristics. They were very clear. They wanted, the rate of positive tests to be 5% or below. They wanted the rates of infections and the rates of hospitalizations in particular to be going down for 14 consecutive days. They chose 14, right, because that's the sort of incubation period of the virus. Um, and, it was realistic in that if you looked at the countries that were faced with COVID before we were, they were able to sort of do that. Even if you look at New York, New Jersey, places within the United States, they were sort of on the path. They were making progress on these measurable goals. Um, but a lot of states chose to reopen before those goals were met. And, there's a lot of concern now that by doing so, we are prolonging this first wave. We're seeing these increased spikes. And you know, uh, Unfortunately, they chose to act before the goals were met. Now, of course, there's balancing to be done in terms of economic recovery, but that's, I think, a very, very good example. Um, a sort of broader example might be what I have written down here, providing increased opportunities for low-income children to succeed in life. Um, Now, there's a couple of things here, and I want you to read this very carefully before I talk about it. So, provide increased opportunities for low income children to succeed in life. And I want you to think about the application of those three characteristics to this goal that I've stated. And so I'm just going to give you a minute to think about it, or if you want, just go ahead and pause the video, write down some things that maybe jump out at you about this particular example, some things that might be potentially problematic with it. I'll do a dramatic pause by drinking water, in case you're wondering. Uh-huh. Okay, so there's a couple potential problems with this as a goal. Um, the word opportunities is pretty vague. What exactly do we mean by opportunities? Are we talking about economic opportunities? Are we talking about health opportunities? What is it exactly that we mean by that word? Low income children. Um, there might be some sort of doubts as to exactly how clearly that's defined. But generally speaking, when we use the term low income children, it has some relation with the poverty line. And so we could make it clear, but we may not really want to make that one super clear, because we may want to be able to use kids and families at different income levels in order to evaluate and compare. And then the last phrase, to succeed in life, right? That sounds awesome. Certainly seems like a laudable goal. Um, but what the hell do we mean by it, right? How do we define success? Again, are we talking about economic success? Are we talking about family success? Are we talking about um, better health outcomes, better education outcomes? Whatever it is that we think is a problem for low income kids, we need to be a little bit clearer in how we're defining that. It would be okay to have this as like an intro statement about your goals, but then you would need to lay out more specific things underneath it and how it is that you're going to measure them. Okay. Um, So if you want to see how the government has done this in the past, there's a web link here, performance.gov, and you can get an idea at how this particular administrative agency and this particular program within Department of Health and Human Services lays out the goals, lays out how they measure progress, lays out what progress has been made, so that we can see then what else needs to be done. But so these are things that governments use, right? And so it's important to understand this before we dive in to any actual evaluation or analysis. Okay. let's talk about some specific criteria. Here's why we select criteria. And the key part of this is we are going to select criteria before we do the analysis. We do that so that we can remain objective, because different policy tools, different alternatives are going to be more or less effective, more or less politically feasible, more or less equitable in how they distribute the costs and the benefits. And if we wait until after we've done all the analysis and gathered all the data, there is a temptation for us to pick the ones that are going to point towards our preferred alternative. And oftentimes people do have preferred sort of default alternatives that can be based on values, on things like ideology. Okay, so we want to lay out the criteria that we're going to use in advance. And then once we do that, and once we gather the data, we sort of run the analysis, it actually allows us to rank the alternatives, so that we are using the same criteria, the same measures for each one. If we don't do that, if there isn't some commonality, some common language, you can't directly compare them, right? It's the classic apples and oranges and that kind of thing. So that's why we are choosing criteria, and why we need to do it in advance. There are lots of different ones, okay, that you can choose. I'm going to talk about some of the more common ones. But this is somewhere where you can get a little creative. Okay, there is a certain art to policy analysis that it would be good for people to explore. But in general, we want to make sure that we're using more than one. Okay, if you just have one, well, it's not very realistic. Okay, because there's going to be different criteria and different alternatives are going to satisfy those criteria at different levels. So we want to use more than one. The exact number is up to the analyst. For your papers here, you have to use at least 3 and no more than 4. And the reason I put a cap on it is it can make it more difficult to actually rank the alternatives and to make a recommendation based on your evaluation. And this often occurs when the criteria aren't able to be measured in a meaningful numerical manner. A lot of political arguments about policy really come down to which criteria they're using to evaluate the policy. And our selection of criteria often revolves around values and ideology and that kind of thing. So, one analyst, one group of analysts, one political party, what have you, may want to look at, well, what's going to be the effect and what's going to be the cost, right? How much is this going to cost taxpayers to do? They might look at threats to individual liberty. Is requiring people to wear a mask too much of a threat to individual liberty? Other people are going to look at more sort of communal aspects. And so they're going to say, well, it's not a threat to individual liberty because the reason you're wearing them is to protect other people from catching COVID should you have it, and particularly should you have it and not know. So these underlying values, community versus individual, market versus government, all of these things can have an impact on the criteria that people choose, and that results in political arguments that go nowhere. And it just becomes values again, and you can't argue values. So this is what I was just talking about. And I'm not going to go back through what I was talking about, but one thing that is worth focusing on is when you are selecting your criteria, um, it is not just okay, but probably a good idea to select a dominant criterion. And this is very easy to do. All you say is, this is going to be my primary criterion. Um, Personally, um, I think when you're talking about a neutral, objective policy analysis, effectiveness ought to be, uh, in most situations, your primary criterion. Secondarily, it could be cost effectiveness. Um, some people, though, might put political feasibility at the top, and this just reflects a belief that, look, it's better to get something done than nothing. Um, and so there's no right answer there. It's just a matter of what uh, importance you're placing on the different criteria. Okay, you can even go through and just rank them, like 1 through 3. This is going to be the most important, this is the second most important, this is the third most important. This is not something you necessarily have to do in advance, although it's generally a good idea. But when you're making your recommendations, you can say, this is how I am ranking the criteria, uh, and so this is how I'm going to make my decisions. Again, transparency is the key. Making sure that you're clear in which criteria are being given more weight. All right, so let's get to the actual criteria. And there are several. In the next slide, we'll give you more detail on some of them, but there are generally 4 criteria that people tend to use in almost every policy analysis. The first one is effectiveness, and this is just a very simple question of how well does the alternative meet the stated goal. Okay, and this is the link between the goal and the alternative. Um, Obviously, we want things that are going to be effective, right? We're trying to make people's lives better. So you would think that if there's some policy out there that doesn't achieve its goal, we shouldn't do it, because it's a gigantic waste of money and resources. And, we always have to keep in mind that when we pursue one particular policy, when we put money and part of our limited resources towards that particular policy, we're not putting it towards something else. So you would think that that's true. Unfortunately, governments pursue policies all the time for reasons that are largely symbolic, or because it seems like they ought to work, even though all the evidence shows that they don't. And I'll just give you one example that most of you are probably familiar with, and honestly, you shouldn't be familiar with, but you are, and that's DARE. Just this is when I wish we were live, and I could be like, how many of you had DARE, in your middle school or your high school? And I would bet 75% of you at least probably did. And I know I did when I was in school, because DARE has been around for a pretty long time. It started in 1983, and rapidly spread throughout the country. And this quote right here about it being in 75% of our school districts in 52 countries and around the world, that was about 10 years ago, that was true, but it still seems largely true. But, here's the thing about DARE. Numerous analyses over long periods of time show that DARE is simply not effective in reducing drug use amongst kids. Most of the studies find no statistically significant effect. In fact, some of them find statistically significant negative effects, which means, that kids are sitting there and they never really thought about weed, And these cops come in there and talk about what it does to them and how horrible it is. And the kid's sitting there, they're going, "Oh, doesn't sound so bad to me. You know, kind of sounds like fun." um, and they then engage in more drug use. I give you a random story from my own life. I I went to this little private high school. I had like 35 people in my graduating class, so we were able to do all kinds of things that you can't do in a big public school. And one of them was one day when we were maybe seniors, when I was a senior in high school, we got to like go to work day. And this wasn't like go to work with my dad or my mom. I could just pick anywhere and give them a call and say, "Hey, would you mind if I come hang out with you during the day?" And me and a friend of mine decided we wanted to go down to the police department and just sort of see how things worked. And so we did, and we got to ride around with a cop and ask, important questions like, exactly how much over the speed limit can I go without getting a ticket? Um, and what's crazy is the cop told us. Um, he's like, generally speaking, this is the rule. Um, anyhow, uh, that's not particularly relevant to Dare, but here's here's what happened later in the day. Is we go back to the police station, and the cops like, "Hey, you guys want to see the evidence locker?" And we were like, "Yeah." So he lets us into the evidence locker, and we're not really supposed to touch things, but we're looking around like guns and lead pipes and all kinds of other things that were used in the commission of various crimes. And then there was the drug cabinet. Um, and I'm literally not kidding or exaggerating here. But he was like, "Hey, check this out." And he grabs like a double, lined paper grocery bag. Hopefully, y'all actually know what those look like. Um, and he hands it to me, and I look inside, and it's just full of marijuana, whole thing. And like, I was sitting there like picking up handfuls of it. Anyhow, totally random story, maybe not that related to Dare, but shows to a certain extent maybe the mentality and maturity of a 17, 18-year-old boy who's being told not to use drugs by police in the classroom, but then like being shown drugs when to work with them. Anyhow, Dare is a gigantic waste of money. I will say that the federal government finally stopped funding Dare under the Obama administration, so it's fairly recent. I haven't checked to see if it's been revived, but lots of state governments, lots of local school districts still do this. They still send cops into schools to talk about the horrors of drugs. So let's move on. Efficiency, okay? Efficiency is related to effectiveness in that effectiveness is half of the equation. What we're talking about is, do the benefits outweigh the costs? So another way of thinking about efficiency is cost effectiveness, where we're seeing how much it costs per unit of effectiveness. Because we're trying to be as efficient as possible. Okay, we want to get the most bang for our buck. And a classic example of this comes in the debate surrounding climate change policy and what we ought to be doing. And the debate is basically this: should we be actively working now to maximize the reduction of uh, pollution and other things that are causing climate change? Or do we accept the fact that climate change is occurring and is going to occur, and maybe place a little bit more resources on adaptation, on adapting to a changed environment, of putting money into research and development of technology and other things so that we can continue to grow crops, we can continue to live in certain parts of the world, and that kind of thing. And it really comes down to an argument about efficiency. Where is it most beneficial for us to focus our limited resources? Um, and I'll say that originally, back in the 90s and 2000 aughts, um, most of the focus was on mitigation, on reducing, for example, greenhouse gas emissions and that kind of stuff. Um, and we actually have been successful, not completely successful, but if you look at the data over time, uh, air generally is cleaner today than it was 40 years ago, um, even especially 60 years ago. But we started moving more into an adaptation framework because we know that at this point, with the level of emissions and things like that that are going on and that have gone on, that the global temperature rise is going to happen. It's going to be a certain amount of degrees. And so we're going to have to adapt. Um, so that's just an example of how this particular criteria plays out in a particular policy realm. Uh, the next one is equity. By equity, I just mean fairness. It is not equality. Okay, it's fairness. And yes, we can differ on what our definition of fairness is in any particular situation. And yes, fairness is not objective, but it often is measurable. We can look at the distributional effects of policies. We can see who's being harmed and who's benefiting. Um, but uh, the bottom line is, in public policy, fairness matters, and it largely matters due to its impact on political feasibility and social acceptability. Um, and so while it can be hard to quantify, we generally can look at policy alternatives and sort of rank them in terms of best to worst, in terms of what we define as fairness. Oftentimes, you'll see this play out in the debate over process versus outcomes. For anybody who's taken 240 or anything like that, 340. This is the whole Nozick-Rawls debate. Do we care more about outcomes or do we care more about process? And this is largely defined in the United States along ideological terms, where Democrats are seen, at least perceived, as being more focused on outcomes, whereas Republicans are perceived as being more focused on process. The argument being, look, we can't do a whole lot about the outcomes because there's so much stuff going on here, but we can set up a process that is objectively fair, and then we just have to accept whether outcomes come from that. So this is related to the fourth one, which is political feasibility. So how likely it is to actually pass. And this involves a good understanding of the current political environment, of the relevant institutions, the relevant players, right? Who it is that's going to be making these decisions, what checks may be in place against those decision makers. And again, this is something you can't put a number on, right? It's 75% likely. But you can certainly rank them high to low. If you have, a most like a Republican controlled legislature, it's a pretty fair bet that anything that involves substantially raising taxes probably isn't gonna pass. Not definitely, but it's gonna face a whole lot of additional barriers. So those are the ones that we use the most often. This is something I took from a different textbook, not the one that you all have, but a somewhat more comprehensive list of criteria that are used a lot. And again, you can see effectiveness, efficiency, equity up there in sort of the top three positions. The liberty freedom thing, is something that is very, very important in the United States. It's something that's given a little bit less prevalence in other parts of the world, but it is something we definitely ought to consider when our policy proposals, our alternatives are going to pose some threat to individual liberty. Um, but you can see some other ones down here that you might want to consider. Social acceptability, right? While we don't live in a democracy, there is a certain level of social acceptability that is necessary for policies to pass and for the public to accept their legitimacy. Again, we see this playing out today, where requirements to wear a mask, requirements to social distance, there are chunks of society that are just unwilling to accept that. They see it as a threat to their individual liberty. They see it as a threat to their way of life. Um, and if people aren't going to accept it, then they're not going to follow the policy. And then the policy is not going to be as effective as it otherwise would be. It's also going to increase the costs because we have to enforce the policy. Whereas if people just accept that they have to wear masks, there's very little cost there. Um, it's sort of a fascinating phenomenon. It gives you some insight into the role of culture in public policies. If you look at the differences between, say, the United States and China, or really most of Asia, the United States is a very individualistic culture, whereas they are much more communal in nature. And if you ask, some, Chinese people to wear masks, they're just like, yeah, okay. Um, because they are more outward focused. They're more concerned about their elderly or other members of their family that might be concerned. It's really, even in non-pandemic times, if you're over in Japan or China or South Korea, um, it is not uncommon to see people wearing masks in public. Um, and generally, this is something that say they have like a cold, or they feel like maybe they have the regular flu or something like that, but they need to go out in public. Well, they just voluntarily put on a mask because they see that as an important role in their culture to protect other people. Um, so social acceptability is going to be different in different places and at different periods of time. It's even different in different places within the United States, largely dependent on dominant cultures. Some other things to think about are things like administrative feasibility. Does the government, the institution responsible for implementing a policy, do they actually have the capacity to do this? Um, if not, what extra resources would be needed to do it? You see this a lot in immigration policy, where any calls for large-scale deportations, or the flip side, amnesty type programs. Um, Bottom line is, if we were to do a full-scale amnesty or legalization, or we were to do a full-scale sort of deportation program, we simply don't have the administrative capacity to do either one. We saw this in the 1980s, when there was an amnesty under the Reagan administration, um, where the then Immigration and Naturalization Service didn't have the capacity to process all of the applications of people that were potentially eligible for a green card. So what they did was they farmed it out. They actually financed, to a certain extent, nonprofit agencies, a lot of churches actually, um, to help them process these applications. Um, but that was an additional cost that came in. Now with immigration, it's a little bit different because immigration processing is largely self-funded by the fees that people pay. But it still gives you an idea of what may be necessary. And the last one on here is technical feasibility or technological feasibility. Does the technology exist uh, for it? You can see this in the COVID debates when you're talking about vaccines. Okay, we're not there yet. There are lots of debates about when we might get there. You've got the Trump administration saying by the end of the year. You've got most sort of scientific community saying, maybe by the end of 2021, if we're lucky, mid 2021. But either way, we don't have a vaccine right now. And so that affects what we can do in terms of, say, reopening the economy, reopening the campus. Um, I know a lot of students are very wary about being back in a campus environment where there are large numbers of people, whether you're one of them or not, living in dormitories where social distancing is practically impossible. Um, and, you know, it's people aren't just going to wear masks all the time in their own bedrooms. Um, and so, if we had a vaccine, then these reopenings, these living in dorms, all of these things that we really want to do um, would be much more feasible. So that can play a huge role. You see it in environmental policy as well. Um, when you're looking at things, this is a random example, but there are huge parts of the ocean that are essentially just giant plastic floating islands, um, and it has all kinds of harmful effects on the ecosystem there. Um, but we don't really have a good way of cleaning it up. There have been some progress made in the last just 5 years in terms of some technology that helps sort of sweep the ocean, if you will. But that is something that is hard to do at this point in time. So those are some other ones, and I just wanted to give you some other ones that I think can be important and that people often overlook. The first one is time. And there's lots of different ways that this can be used as a criterion. How long is it going to take for the policy to become effective? How much time are the costs and the benefits spread out over? Are we in a crisis situation? Is this something that needs to be done right now? So one of the big arguments in terms of the phased reopenings is that, look, we have to get our economy going now. We can't wait for a vaccine. So that is, whether it's transparent, whether it's overt or not, a big criterion that people are using in making these arguments. So often this is defined in terms of short-term versus long-term. And this is an ongoing issue. Remember, I talked about this as one of Wieland's problems. There's often a conflict between policies that are effective over the long term that aren't short term politically feasible, because most of our politicians operate on a short term re-election cycle. Random example about the impact of time when it comes to getting projects done is this building over here that you can see. Hopefully you recognize it as the Sydney Opera House. Sort of a fascinating history and how that thing got built, where the original architect had laid out plans for how long it was going to take, how much it was going to cost. They started the project, and then the Australian government said, no, we're not going to pay that much. We're not going to pay you. Architect quit. They brought somebody else in to do it. They ended up doing it, but it took like an extra 14 years and cost like 5 times as much as they had originally proposed. And then it turned out that they didn't really like the end result, so they had to bring the original architect back in the 2000s And all this started in like the 50s or 60s. Um, and anyhow, um, okay. Um, so that is something that we can consider. Sorry, I had something pop up on my screen and I had to think about it for a minute. Uh, it also reflects changing goals in that the decision makers themselves often change while a policy is being implemented. And if they have different goals, they might stop the implementation or they might try to uh, uh, make it more difficult. And you saw this with the Affordable Care Act, like I've talked about before, um, where when the Republicans were able to take over Congress in 2010, and they had very different goals that they wanted to see from any kind of healthcare reform. Well, it drastically changed how that policy played out. Technology is another part of time. And a lot, again, of this sort of idea of climate change adaptation is assuming that the technology is going to become available largely through market forces or government investment. Uh, but that's that's a big assumption, and it's an assumption based on history. That things have um, technology has advanced at such rapid rates that we think that we'll be able to handle things in the future. There is a spatial dimension in terms of what level of aggregation we're talking about. And what I mean there is, are we talking sort of local level, county level, state level, federal level, world level? Um, and again, this becomes important with things like environmental policy, where there's a lot of spillover effects. So that if, for example, California institutes more serious greenhouse gas emissions requirements, well, that doesn't only affect California and Californians. It affects people in Oregon and Washington and Nevada and Utah and New Mexico and Arizona and all those places over there. And really, it's going to affect sort of everybody. Um, and so we need to think about that spatial dimension that often uh, is sort of um, measured, if you will, by the level of government involved. Other things, like, so which costs do we include? Um, which benefits do we include, right? Are we going to include the benefits to Oregonians from the California policy? Um, there's also a general preference in U.S. policy to have policy made as locally as possible. And the general thinking there is because there are different conditions, different environments, different cultures throughout the United States, that they ought to be able to adapt or adopt different policies according to those conditions. Um, so another aspect of local bias is what we call NIMBYism, or so NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. If you think about nuclear power, this is a classic NIMBY situation in the United States that largely has to do with our own individualistic culture. Um, but a lot of people are very scared of nuclear power, um, and they don't want nuclear power plants anywhere near where they live because the potential catastrophe is so huge that they're not really able to look at it rationally. Uh, in that nuclear power is relatively clean. At least it doesn't have huge greenhouse gas emissions. If you go somewhere like France, where something like 98% of their power is nuclear, um, they're generally okay with this. But again, it's a cultural difference. So something you need to keep in mind. So I already talked about DARE. This is something that we're going to talk about several times throughout the course of the semester, and I just want to be clear. And that's the difference between cost-benefit analysis and cost efficiency analysis. We're going to be doing both in this class. But for your papers, you're not going to be doing cost-benefit analysis, and hopefully you'll see why here in just a minute. So cost-benefit analysis looks at the net costs, the net benefits. And what it's looking at is a specific project, okay, a specific policy. So if you think about light rail, this is something that's been debated for decades in the Triangle region. And we sort of gone towards light rail and then back and then towards and then back, and who knows where we are right now. But it is measuring numerically in dollar figures what these costs and benefits are. And the general decision-making process is that if the net benefits outweigh the net costs, it's probably worth doing. Cost efficiency is looking at getting the biggest effect for the lowest price. Okay, there's a relation here, but you don't have to measure the effectiveness in dollar terms. You can look, for example, at percentage reductions in childhood obesity. And you can say, okay, which one costs the least amount per 1% reduction in obesity? That is more of what we're going to be doing in this class, and especially in your papers, okay? So just remember, no one should be doing a cost-benefit analysis for your brief. Okay, that is something that we're going to do separately, okay, at the end of the semester. And I do it at the end of the semester so that nobody tries to do it for their paper. Already did that. So when you're thinking about making decisions based on different criteria and comparing alternatives, again, you can sort of make a table. And you don't need to do this necessarily for your papers because you're not going to probably be able to come up with these specific of numbers. But if you look at what I have here, right, you've got alternative one. So the cost there, you can just assume it's say $50 million. The effectiveness is a 25% reduction in whatever. You can, maybe we'll say childhood obesity. And then you got political feasibility, which again is a high, medium, low type deal. So, stop for a minute and think about which one of these you would recommend. Would it be alternative one, alternative two, or alternative three? So pause the video, take a minute, look at it, and try to come up with what you think is the right recommendation. Okay. This is something maybe we can talk about when we meet live. You're not going to have a chance to watch this before that anyway. So I'll go ahead and talk about how one generally would do this. You've got these three alternatives, and you can go through and you can actually come up with a cost effectiveness ratio. And the way you could do this either way, you could put cost over effectiveness, okay? And what that's going to do, if you take alternative one, you've got 50 over 25. Simplify that to 2. What that means is it's going to cost $2 million per percentage reduction in childhood obesity. Okay, and you can see that's got a high political feasibility. It means it's likely to be passed. You then go to alternative 2. You put 100 over 35. Right, that's going to be 8-ish, something like that. So it's going to cost more for each unit of effectiveness, and it's got a low political feasibility. Well, just comparing alternative 1 to alternative 2, you see that alternative 1 is dominant, meaning that in terms of cost effectiveness and political feasibility, it is the better option. So you can get rid of alternative 2 altogether. Okay. That said, somebody who is primarily focused on effectiveness might choose alternative 2 because it is the highest effectiveness. So there is an argument to be made there. You look at alternative 3, okay, 20 over 15, that's like 1.25. So it is significantly more cost effective than alternative 1, but it has a lower political feasibility. It also has a lower overall cost, but a lower overall effectiveness. And so, that one's a little bit, I'm not sure. And what you'll see is people differ on these things. Okay, some people are going to say, I want alternative 1 because even though it costs more, it's more effective and it has a high political feasibility. Some people may choose 3 because it has a lower cost effectiveness ratio and it's still somewhat likely to get passed. This is why you have to be transparent about which one you are putting higher priority on, higher emphasis on. And so long as you're transparent, nobody can really say you're wrong. All they can say is, I would choose a different level of ranking in terms of the criteria being used. That's totally fine, right? And we can accept that as an equally valid conclusion. So that's the basics of criteria and how they play out. The next lecture that'll be posted will be on alternatives. So actually going through the basic policy tools that governments have available to them to solve social problems, and talking a little bit about sort of recommendations and stuff. So hope that was not totally boring. I look forward to talking to everybody soon, and check you later.